Thank you for attending tonight's program In Her Footsteps, Radium Girls of Ottawa, Illinois. My name is Sarah Davis, and I'm the Public Programs Educator at the Illinois State Museum. And this program is part of a four-part series taking place the fourth Tuesday of the month through June, featuring Illinois women and their contributions to history, culture, and society. Its aim is to encourage Illinoisans to learn more about women's history in their region and perhaps travel virtually or in person to learn more about their stories. The women featured in the program will also be included along with other female historical figures on the museum's new In Her Footsteps Illinois Women's History Trail website, scheduled to launch in May. The website will pinpoint locations across the state connected to women who have contributed to Illinois history. It will summarize each woman's story and provide information on historic sites and markers that the public can visit. I'd like to introduce Erika Holst, the history curator with the Illinois State Museum.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. As Sarah said, the series is meant to introduce you to some of the women in Illinois history that you perhaps may have heard of, but maybe don't know why you've heard of them or know about them but want to know more. So tonight we're going to be talking about the Radium Girls of Ottawa, Illinois, and this is a sad story, kind of a tragic story, but the women that we're talking about unwittingly and kind of unwillingly did make a giant contribution to occupational workplace safety. So we'll just dive into their story. So it began in 1922 when the Radium Dial Company opened up in Ottawa, Illinois, and they placed this advertisement in the newspaper. They were looking for the services of several girls for studio work. They started by hiring 50 girls. Eventually they had as many as 200 on staff. And ostensibly they were hiring girls ages 18 and up, but really, nobody really said anything if there were younger girls that took work. There's documented cases of girls as young as 11 years old who were working in this painting studio. So the women who took these jobs were working class young women of Ottawa. Many of them were immigrants or daughters of immigrants. And these are women that were absolutely thrilled to get this work because work at the Radium Dial Company put them among the top 5% of wage earners in the United States. They made far more than they could make as shop girls or in other factory work or in domestic service. They got paid typically 1.5 cents per dial that they painted, and some of the girls who were fast at painting could actually make more money than their fathers. So they all felt very lucky to have this opportunity to work. And the work itself consisted of painting numbers onto dials. For the Radium Dial Company was its own thing, but one of its biggest clients was the West Clocks Company, which was right around the corner in LaSalle, Illinois. And so these were luminous dial clocks, and they were being painted with a radium-based paint that was mixed with water and gum arabic and zinc sulfate to make it glow. And radium was an element that had been discovered by Pierre and Marie Curie in 1898, so it was relatively new to the scene. And it gained in popularity for its luminous properties during World War I because it made more sense for soldiers in the trenches to have wristwatches or pocket watches that were luminous, that would glow, rather than trying to shine a flashlight to illuminate a pocket watch. So it took off in military circles during the war, and when the war ended, they kind of burst on the scene for the general consumer. So business was booming. These clocks were being produced at a fast clip, and there was plenty of work for the girls. So when these girls were hired, they would start out on the Big Ben. That's the big alarm clock in the center there. And as their skills improved with painting the numbers, they would kind of be promoted up and tackle smaller and smaller clocks until the girls who are the most skilled would be painting the pocket bends right there. And so those are tiny pocket watches where the numbers were so tiny that the brushes they needed to paint with them were only about 30 hairs thick. So the process for painting these dials was each woman would be given, she would mix her own paint. So she would get the radium powder, she would get water, she would get the gum arabic, and she would mix a solution. She would be given a tray of dials. And the problem was that radium was sort of an expensive element, and the brushes kind of like splayed everywhere. And so the girls were taught to point their brushes. And this is a process of putting the brush in your mouth and kind of licking it to get a fine pointed tip on the brush. And so they called it lip dip paint. They would dip the brush in their mouth, dip it in the paint, and then paint on the numbers. And so literally these women, as they were painting, were ingesting radium as they painted. And they were told that it's fine, it'll put roses in your cheeks. Radium was all around them. There was radium powder dust everywhere, so that women would come home and their clothes would glow. In fact, some of them enjoyed the effect so much that they would wear their best dresses to work so they could take them out if they were going to a party afterwards, and they would glow. They would be seen walking through town and they would have this ghostly glow around them. And so they were known as the ghost girls. And it was sort of this elite status to be able to work so closely with the radium. And each girl was assigned a new kind of allotment of radium and painting materials for her morning shift and her afternoon shift. So if she had some left over from her morning shift, she might take it home, or some of the women would go into the dark room. They would paint their eyebrows and their lips and their eyelashes and see how they glowed in the dark. They had fun and they enjoyed playing with this luminescent paint. And nobody had a problem with this. In fact, it was considered healthful. They felt very lucky. Radium was considered a miracle element in the beginning of the 20th century. It was a very expensive substance. It cost $120,000 a gram. So it was this luxury miracle substance, and it was being touted everywhere. You see there's radium treatments for gray hair, radium beauty treatments, radium water. Radium was thought to be able to extend life. So it was really considered this, miracle, life-giving substance. And of course, some of these products that are being advertised, they didn't necessarily have radium in them. Some of them just kind of like latched on to the cachet of radium. But some people, really were drinking radium water. So these girls felt like they were lucky to have these well-paying jobs where they got to work with this precious substance and go through town literally glowing, and people, knew who they were, and in this elite circumstance. And so this lasted, in the beginning, all was well, and they thought that the fun times would never end. It took a few years before some women started to experience ill health, and the symptoms varied greatly. Some girls were limping, some had pains in their joints and hips, some had loose teeth. Some people's teeth actually fell out and left sores in their mouth that didn't heal. Some people were anemic. And so they would go to their doctors, and the doctors didn't know what was wrong with them. First of all, radium poisoning wasn't generally known, so it wasn't something that the doctors would conclude, especially doctors in Ottawa, which is a fairly small town. It also was the case that so many girls had so many different symptoms that no doctor was able to connect the dots and say, oh, these girls all worked at the Radium Dial Company. It was just, all these young women sort of mysteriously presenting with these ailments, and no one really knew where they were coming from. So the woman on the left, her name is Mary Ellen Cruz. Her friends called her Ella. And in 1927, she was 24 years old, and she developed a pimple on her left cheek. And that pimple swelled and swelled up. And she went to a doctor, and he tried to open it for her, and nothing came out of it. It became even more swollen. Her face became infected, and she developed a fever. And then septic poisoning set in, and she died. And so the cause listed on her death certificate was streptococcic poisoning. She had been an employee at the Radium Dial Company. And she was one of many women who fell ill and ultimately died, whose deaths were attributed to something else, because at first no one knew to connect the dots to radium poisoning, and later on no one wanted to admit to radium poisoning. The girl on the right's name was Margaret Looney. She went by Peg. She was engaged to, she's the one in the center in the white dress. She was engaged to her fiance, Chuck Hackensmith, who's got his arm around her there. She also worked at the Radium Dial Company, and by 1929, she was feeling very weak and lethargic. She had anemia, she had pain in her hip, teeth and even bits of her jaw were falling out. It got to the point where her fiance had to pull her around in a red wagon because she didn't have the strength to move around on her own. On August 6, 1929, she collapsed at work, and she was sent to a doctor's, the company doctor's hospital by the Radium Dial Company, who I should add by that time was well aware that radium was toxic to its workers. There had been cases in New Jersey of other women at a dial plant out there who were falling sick and dying and suing the company. So the Radium Dial Company stepped in when Peg Looney collapsed and whisked her away to their own company doctor's hospital. Her family was forbidden to see her, and Peg died a week later. The company tried to take her body and bury it, but the family refused and said, no, she's a Catholic girl. We're going to take her home to Ottawa and bury her in the Catholic cemetery. So the company tried to ask if they could perform an autopsy, and the family agreed, but they said, we'd like our own doctor to be present at this autopsy. And the family and the company came to an agreement. A time was settled on, and when the family doctor arrived to provide the autopsy, they found that the company doctor had been there and performed the autopsy an hour earlier. So the family really was, was cut out of the loop, and the radium company was acting like they had something to hide. The cause of death, incidentally, for Peg Looney was listed as diphtheria on her death certificate. So this is what the Radium Dial Company knew by that point. They knew that radium was poisonous. They knew that radium in the body the same way calcium does, and it will settle itself in the bones. It'll be metabolized like calcium and settle in bones. And they also knew that radiation is composed of 3 different rays: alpha, beta, and gamma, or this is what they knew at the time. And that alpha rays are the most disruptive to human beings. They would cause the most problems. Luckily, most people don't have to worry about it because alpha rays are the least able to penetrate. They're stopped by skin. They can be stopped by a piece of paper. But what was happening with these girls who were ingesting radium and metabolizing it was that the radium was going to their bones, and now there's nothing. There's no piece of paper. There's no layer of skin. They're literally being irradiated from the inside out. And so the doctors knew that radiation poisoning makes bones weak and brittle. They knew that radiation settling in bones next to the blood marrow, the bone marrow where blood is made, creates anemia. They knew that radiation had a half-life of 1,600 years, which means that these girls would still be radioactive for more than a century after ingesting this paint. And they knew that radiation poisoning was incurable and untreatable. And they knew this because of the radium dial painters in New Jersey. By the time the company opened in Ottawa in 1922, the first girl had already died in New Jersey. And by the mid-1920s, several more women had died and were filing lawsuits. And they were kind of holding their breaths, hoping that the girls who worked in their plant in Ottawa weren't reading the New York Times or the national news, which it turns out they weren't. There were whispers going around the company that, we've heard that maybe radium is toxic, and there's whispers of what's going on in New Jersey. And the company came back to them and they said, it'll put roses in your cheeks, or there's nothing to worry about. The company also commissioned its own internal results that concluded that radium was poisonous to people. And they took those internal results and altered the final report. And they brought in company doctors and ran medical tests on their employees. They did this in 1925 and again in 1928. And they found that more than half of their employees were radioactive. These results were never shared with the women, and they were essentially buried. So this is knowing all that. This is what the Radium Dial Company told their employees. You're looking at a quarter-page ad that they took out in 1928 in the local newspaper. And it's a lot of text, but the key point is that they say, we have at frequent intervals had thorough physical and medical examinations made by well-known physicians and technical experts familiar with the conditions and symptoms of the so-called radium poisoning. Nothing even approaching such symptoms or conditions has ever been found by these men. On the contrary, they have commented on the high standard of health and appearance of our employees. So the company lied to all of them, just bald-faced lie that radium is not poisonous, your health is all okay, there's nothing amiss here, or keep going as always. And again, this is a small town. It's a company town. There's a lot of people employed at this company. And so the employees were looking for reassurance and they felt that they had it. They were relieved, you know, okay, our company who provides our livelihood is swearing that they care about our health and safety and that there's nothing wrong. So they proceeded on. But meanwhile, the women are getting worse and whispers about radiation poisoning are continuing to fly. And more women are getting ill. They're having symptoms again, like sore jaws, aching hips, anemia, sarcomas, loose teeth. They're seeing doctors who still aren't connecting the dots between all these young women and their symptoms and their employment at the Radium Dial Corporation. One woman said that she was 36 years old, but she felt like she was 75. Catherine Wolf, who's on the left there, had been working. She was one of the first employees. She started in 1922. She worked until 1931 when her company fired her because they said that she was limping and her limping was starting to scare the other girls and they thought it was bad for business and they didn't want to lose any other employees. So she was unceremoniously let go. On the right is Charlotte Nevins Purcell. She had only worked for a bit in the 1920s. She was no longer employed by the time she married and had 3 children. But at age 28, she developed a very painful lump in her arm. This was a sarcoma, and her doctors basically told her that you have to choose between your arm or your life. And she chose her arm. She wanted to survive for her children, so she had her arm amputated at the shoulder. So Charlotte, or Catherine Wolf on the left, not finding any satisfactory answers or help from local physicians, went to a doctor in Chicago. And this doctor, whose name was Dr. Loeffler, was the first person who said, you know, yes, you are suffering from radiation poisoning, and it's directly related to the work you did at the Dial plant. And so armed with this knowledge, some of the current and former employees of the Radium Dial Company decided to take their fight to court. And by now it's the 1930s, and so it's in the middle of the Great Depression. And many of them are crippled with medical bills. They keep seeking relief for conditions for which there ultimately is no relief, but they visit doctor after doctor. They pay for pain medication. Many of them had mortgaged their houses. And also being in the Great Depression, many of their husbands were now out of work and they were too ill to work themselves. So finances were tight in their house, and they needed money. They needed money to pay for the medical bills for the ailments that they contracted while working for the Radium Dial Company. They faced a lot of headwinds from the town of Ottawa. They were perceived as attacking this company that was providing all kinds of jobs and stability during the Great Depression. The company was putting out propaganda that said, oh, these women were sick when we hired them and we took a chance on them and we hired these ill women as an act of kindness, and now look what they're doing. These women couldn't find any local attorneys who would take their case, again, because they sort of closed ranks around the local business community. So they were sort of being shunned socially and not finding any help, either medical or legal, within their town. So they did have to look to Chicago. And so finally in 1934, they found an attorney named Jay Cook who would take on their case. He took it on for free, and they filed a suit against the Radium Dial Company, and also in civil court and with the Illinois Industrial Commission. And they sued for $50,000. And the lead woman on the case was a woman named Inez Balat, who had worked at the company for several years, who her friends described as a living corpse by this time. But the Radium Dial Company had a team of top lawyers, and so their counter argument was multifaceted. First, they argued that the statute of limitations had run out, that Inez had filed her suit after she left the company, and that her disability did not occur while she was employed with Radium Dial Company. And they also argued that radium poisoning was not covered by the Illinois Occupational Diseases Act, which they were suing in violation of. So the girls lost their court case, and their attorney, Jay Cook, took it all the way up to the Illinois Supreme Court, and they lost it every single turn. And less than a year after this, the initial unfavorable ruling, the initial loss, Inez died at age 29 from a hemorrhage from a sarcoma on her neck. And on her death certificate, there's a box that a physician could check that says, was the death in any way related to occupation of the deceased? And her doctors checked no. So the last remaining hope for these women was their case in front of the Illinois Industrial Commission. And what happened then was that the Radium Dial Company closed up shop. The president folded the company and skipped town. And he set up shop in New York on the Lower East Side and kind of started it all over again, hired a new crop of workers, began painting radium dials. But this was a new company, which meant under the eyes of the law, it wasn't liable for anything that the Radium Dial Company had done in Ottawa. So these girls were suing just for a piece of a $10,000 bond that the Radium Dial Company had posted with the commission. And they posted that bond because they had been unable to get insurance for their company, liability insurance, because the insurers felt that it was a poor risk and that radium poisoning was dangerous. So the women found a new attorney. His name was Leonard Grossman, and he took on their case with the Illinois Industrial Commission. And so his lead woman was Catherine Donahue. And Catherine Donahue had married in the early 1930s. She was now the mother of 2 children. She was having trouble walking. Her hips were so sore that she couldn't kneel when she went to her church to pray. Pieces of her jaw were coming out of her mouth. She was almost bedridden by the time the case had its hearing. She was dangerously anemic. She had a tumor on her hip bone the size of a grapefruit, and she weighed only 71 pounds. So in February of 1838, there's a hearing at the LaSalle County Court where Catherine and her fellow radium dial painters showed up to give testimony. And by then, Catherine was really in terrible health. It was all she could do to get to the courthouse. While she was on the stand, she pulled out a jewelry box and showed it to the court. And she said, "These are pieces of my jawbone that came out." And after Catherine took the stand, they put a doctor on the stand for his medical opinion. And he gave his medical opinion that, yes, she was suffering from radiation poisoning. No, she was unable to work. She was unable to work because of the ailments that she had contracted at the Radium Dial Company. And then finally, the attorney asked, is there any cure? And the doctor hesitated and he looked at Catherine, who was in the room, and he said, "Should I say this in front of Mrs. Wolf?" And he said, "Go ahead." And he said, "No, there's no cure. This is fatal, and she doesn't have much time left." And so what you're looking at on the left is an image in the newspaper, a photograph of Catherine Donahue receiving the news, which she probably knew in her heart that what she had was fatal, but hearing it out loud, that she wouldn't live to see her kids grow up, that she would leave her beloved husband behind, and sooner rather than later. And on the right, those are her friends who also came to testify and to witness the trial. So after Catherine Donahue collapsed, the trial was put on hold and would resume the next day. And Catherine was too weak at that point to make it back into the courtroom. So the hearing was actually held in her living room, and she was on the couch surrounded by her friends. And she gave testimony about what it was like to paint, and she demonstrated. Someone handed her a brush and she put it in her mouth and showed how she was taught how to tip the brush to make a fine point on it. And she said, "This is the way they taught us to do it. It was the best way. We had to do it this way." And that they said it was healthy for us, it would put roses in our cheeks, and that there was nothing wrong with us. And so finally, after this hearing, the Illinois Industrial Commission gave its verdict, and finally, it was in the women's favor. They awarded Catherine back medical expenses, salary for when she couldn't find employment due to her illness, and an annual pension of $277. And the Radium Dial Company appealed, and the verdict was upheld in July. And 3 weeks after the verdict was upheld, Catherine Donahue died. At the time of her death, she weighed less than 60 pounds. The Radium Dial Company appealed 8 times in total, all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the verdict was upheld every time. So finally, the company was liable for poisoning its workers, and it was acknowledged that these women had contracted radiation poisoning while on the job at the Radium Dial Company. And so on Catherine Donahue's death certificate, where it says, "Was this illness contracted related to the woman's occupation?" finally on her death certificate, it said yes. So for a lot of these women, those that survived suffered poor health. Many of them died. It was a terrible, terrible toll to pay. But they did, their suffering had a positive impact on people to come. So the Radium Dial women's trials inspired passage of a new Illinois Occupational Diseases Act in 1936 that included provisions for industrial poisoning, which hadn't been part of it before. There were new safety standards for dial painters. The practice of lip dip paint was phased out, and new safety standards were set in place, which was fortunate because World War II broke out. And so there was, again, this increased demand for radium dials for aviation and for soldiers. The workers of the Manhattan Project, who were working to build the atomic bomb and working with radioactive materials, were aware of the Radium Girls case, which had been in the newspapers. And being aware of the dangers of working with radiation, they stipulated non-negotiable safety measures. If they were going to do this work on behalf of the government, there would need to be certain protections in place. And so no doubt many of their lives were saved. Studies were done on the women at the Center for Human Radiobiology at the Argonne National Library. After World War II, it kind of ushered in the atomic age. After the dropping of the atom bomb, it became clear that atomic energy and radiation was going to be part of life. There were nuclear power plants going up. And there was no way to really study the effects of radiation, knowing that it was toxic, except on people that had already unwittingly been exposed. So many of the radium dial workers made the drive to the Argonne National Library to participate in medical tests on the effects of the radiation in their bodies. And some even donated their bodies to science so they could be studied after their deaths. And the Radium Girls were ultimately responsible for the passage of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or the creation, I should say, not the passage. So if you're curious to learn more or take a road trip, there is a statue that you can visit at the corner of Clinton and West Jefferson Streets in Ottawa. And this memorial statue is there because there was an 8th grade student in 2006 who read about the Radium Girls case, which up until that point hadn't really been widely known. And she lobbied her elected officials to create a memorial. And finally, the local citizens of Ottawa embraced the women. They didn't do it at the time when the women were fighting the company, but 80 years later, they rallied together, they held fundraisers, and they raised the $80,000 to erect this statue. So this was unveiled and dedicated by the governor in 2011. And this has been sort of a quick overview. If you want to read more fully, not just about the Ottawa women's experiences, but also the women who worked at the plant in Orange, New Jersey, I can't recommend this book highly enough. This is called The Radium Girls by Kate Moore. Full of information, but beyond that, just written in such an engaging way that you really feel like you get to know each one of the women personally and that you're experiencing life right alongside with them. So please pick it up if you're curious. And with that, I want to thank you for attending, and I would love to start a discussion or field any questions that you might have.
All right, we will get some questions answered here. So one of the first ones we had come in is, why did the Radium Dial factory open in Ottawa in the first place?
I think it was the proximity to the Westclox company. Westclox, which is like a mushing together of Western Clock Company, had already been established in LaSalle. And so having its biggest client like right there sort of made sense.
Another question is, did the company believe that no one would notice the effects of the radium?
That's an interesting question. I think in the beginning, like in the early 1920s, when they first opened, they probably genuinely believed that, you know, like everyone else who was drinking radium water and putting on radium face cream, that, you know, it would put roses in your cheeks. And one of the ironies about radium is that it really did give people rosy cheeks, but that was because of the radiation settling in bones and stimulating the production of bone marrow and blood, which, you know, increased the blood flow, but then it, you know, kept going and then started destroying people from the inside out. I think they were counting on the fact that the symptoms were so widespread that people wouldn't be able to connect the dots. I think they were counting on the fact that local physicians were unfamiliar with radiation poisoning and were kind of hesitant to diagnose it or didn't diagnose it at all. And then I think they were counting on the fact that they had, you know, a deep bench of a legal team who, you know, they were convening scientists and lawyers and writing reports internally and crafting their message. And I think they probably felt like they were going up against small town working class women, and, you know, they had the power to do this.
So we've had a couple questions about the doctors that were brought in when the girls started showing symptoms. One was after the doctor made that diagnosis, did they stop using radium? And did local doctors just not know, or were they paid off or pressured by the company?
So did they stop using radium? No, like the company, no. In fact, there was the Radium Dial Company shut down, but there was another company that opened up called, I think it was called Luminous Dial or Luminous Processes. And that actually was in business until the 1970s. And so although there were safety measures put in place after the Radium Girls won their case with the Illinois Industrial Commission, the company knew and just plunged full speed ahead. The local doctors initially, like I said, weren't able to connect the dots, and also no one was really talking about radiation poisoning. It was sort of, it's not something that was like widely spread in the medical literature or anything they would have seen before. So they weren't familiar with it. And then I think there probably was, and I would have to go back and check the book might, speak more to this. There probably was a sense of pressure internally because the Radium Dial Company was such a big employer in the area that a local doctor didn't want to speak out against this company. And so he would probably look for other explanations besides radium poisoning.
So we've had a couple of questions about what happened in Ottawa after, years later, like becoming a Superfund site, and can you still detect radium in the town?
I don't know the status of the Superfund cleaning. I know it was still a site as late as 2015. So the Radium Dial Company closed down, I believe it was in 1943, or the, what am I saying? No, I'm sorry. That it had closed down in the 1930s when he pulled up stakes and moved to New York. So the building that used to house the Radium Dial Company was vacant for a while. And then there was like a meat packing shop, or maybe it was a butcher there. And there was kind of talk in town that people who bought their meat from there would fall ill. I don't know if anyone's done a study, but there's sort of anecdotal evidence that a lot of people who bought meat at this shop wound up, with cancer or anemia. Eventually, the site was destroyed, and the rubble from the site was used as fill when building local schools and local Section 8 housing, so that those radioactive things are, was still there in town, and then hence the Superfund site. And I can check real quick what year that happened. I'm not finding it. I'll move on to other questions, but I will get back to you if you drop me your email address or if you want to email me about it.
Do you know how many women worked at the Radium Dial Company?
Have that figure for like the total years that it was open. I know that, at any given time there might have been about 200 at its peak, but there was also a lot of turnover because these were young women. Some of them would, some were high school girls who worked for a summer, or some were young women who worked for a year before they got married. So I don't actually know how many passed through, and I don't think we know how many actually died either, because there are so many early on, when it was being attributed to pneumonia or diphtheria, or later on, if someone dies of a cancer, is that cancer related to their work there? So it's a figure that I don't know that we'll ever know.
Were any of the families after that court case, besides the women that filed suit, given any reparations for the harm that were caused?
A few. It wasn't nearly enough. Off the top of my head, I know Charlotte Purcell, the one who had her arm amputated, was awarded $300, which is like basically enough to cover the cost of amputation. And remember that the entire pot of money that all the girls had to work from was only that $10,000 bond that had been posted. So, there wasn't nearly enough money to compensate them for the suffering and loss of life to begin with.
And then after that court case, were any death certificates continued to list as not being affected, death not being caused by workplace, or was that going forward were all deaths attributed to that?
I don't know about like all of them. I think Catherine was the turning point where going forward, if they worked at the Radium Dial Company, and insisted, as many of these women did, that their work had made them ill, I think that was noted. Like I mentioned earlier, I think there were some cases where women might have gotten ill and died from cases that like might have been related and might not, and maybe they didn't put it together, or maybe it was 20 years later, so I think there probably were some misattributed deaths or unaccounted for deaths that came out of it.
Did any of the children of these women have effects from their mothers having so much radium in their bodies?
Um, yes. So Catherine Donahue is the one that I know the most about, and she actually like conceived and gave birth to her two children while she was like actively suffering. And I think there's evidence that radiation poisoning, or the developing fetus, will also draw from the mother's bones and calcium, and so radium can be pulled into her children. And so her little boy lived to be about 30, and then he died. I think it was a heart attack or a stroke at age 30. And the little girl, the newspapers were talking about these little kids and their doomed mother. And when the daughter, Marianne, was a year old, she only weighed 10 pounds. And people were talking about how thin and frail she was. And she lived to be 55 years old. And then I think she died of heart failure as well. So both the children died young. And again, it's unclear, was this a direct cause of their mother's ill health? Marianne had always felt like her ill health was related to her mother, but I don't think anyone drew the straight line on their death certificates.
So we've had several questions about radiation being present in the cemeteries where these women are buried, and if the women had to be buried a certain way in order to prevent the radium from leaching into the soil.
I think they should have been initially. And I saw a documentary that was filmed in 1987 where someone took a Geiger counter to the cemetery, and it was actually like going crazy because of that 1600-year half-life, right? Those women who have long since passed away, their bodies are being irradiated as we speak today. It'll keep going on. And so I believe that later on the women were exhumed and reburied in lead-lined coffins. But I don't know 100% if that was all of them. I know at least some of them were.
Do you know if the factory owners were ever criminally prosecuted?
Nope. Got away.
And someone's asked, do you have a list of all the girls who worked there, or know where they can find out that information?
I don't have a comprehensive list. The Radium Girls book will focus in on a lot of their stories, but again, since so many of them were temporary, I don't know that there's like a comprehensive list out there.
What happened to the company owner after they moved away? Do you have any information?
I think he continued with his Radium Dial business, and I believe he died in the 1950s or 60s. So he was fairly young ish, like he was in his, let's say, early 60s or something. But he was, never prosecuted or held liable or anything. He just kind of went on his merry way.
And is there any evidence of deaths from using radium beauty or health products, or having a clock in your home?
The health and beauty, I don't know. I imagine if it was truly radium and they weren't just like writing the name radium, I would imagine there would be effects, but I don't know that anyone studied that. That would be an interesting study. But if they were ingesting it, like surely that's not good for you. For having a radium clock, I hope not, because I gave my husband a luminous style antique wristwatch before I had heard this story. My sense is because those alpha radiation waves are stopped by something as thin as a sheet of paper, that it's not, but that's a good question, and maybe one should look into it.
Did the story come out about Radium Dial in New York after Ottawa?
Before Ottawa. So it was in Orange, New Jersey was a plant, and they were actually making headlines, and they didn't, and I would have to go back. I focused my research on Ottawa for this. I know initially they had the same kind of run of bad luck or lack of success in the courts that the Ottawa girls did. But that's sort of why the Ottawa company by 1925 and 28 were testing their own employees and then telling them based on these medical tests, like, oh, you're perfectly fine, is because the company had its finger on the pulse of what was going on in New Jersey and was just kind of trying to hope that that information or suspicion didn't trickle down to its employees who, potentially wouldn't want to work there anymore.
All right, we have time for one more question. Given the era, do you think things may have been a little different if they were men and not women?
Yeah, for sure. I think there was a paternalistic attitude within the company, certainly. I think the women were aware, and certainly their unease was growing. And when they went to the bosses, some of them went and said, we'd like to see these medical results. And the bosses said, oh, if you girls saw these medical results, it would cause a riot in here, and didn't give, kind of patted them on the head, and you don't need to know anything. And at one point, Catherine Donahue and Charlotte Purcell had gone in and confronted their former manager and said, look what you did to us. Look at what this radiation poisoning is doing to us. What do you have to say for yourself? How can you help us? And the former manager looked at them, and this is Charlotte Purcell, who's missing an arm, and Catherine Donahue, who's limped in there and was fired for limping to work. And he looked him in the eye and said, there's nothing wrong with you. So I think there was definitely a sense of condescension and paternalism in the way that these women were dealt with that may very well have been different if it had been men.
So thank you, Erika, for your presentation tonight. And thank you everyone for attending the program.